Okay, so hello and welcome back. Today's we're going to be doing a little bit of a different feel and a little different um, presentation probably for the next few videos and maybe even the one before this. I'm not really sure. I don't always record these in order of which I release them. But I am using a new, not really new, and I'm using OBS in an actual slideshow to record this rather than using, well, more complicated editing software in a more complicated process. So anyways, today we're going to be talking about the history of the California Zephyr. But before we get too far into this, into telling the story of the California Zephyr that ran between Chicago and Oakland, California, over the CB&Q, the Rio Grande, and the Western Pacific, I have to introduce the presentation a little bit. So to be point blank about this, because apparently people complain about this a lot in the comments, and by a lot I mean a few people complain, is that I'm clickbaiting or being misleading. In this video, I won't be just doing the history of the California Zephyr, either the pre-Amtrak or the Amtrak version. I will be going over the history of the construction of the route west of Denver, the history of the trains that ran the route before the California Zephyr itself, with a brief talk about the food service, and the history post-coming of Amtrak. So, I am warning you that now this video isn't just about the California Zephyr. Again, either it's Amtrak or pre-Amtrak incarnations. It's about the entirety of the route and its long and storied history. So we're starting the discussion with the route between Denver and Salt Lake City, which began construction in 1904 and would last until the 1920s, with the opening of the famed Moffett Tunnel. The route over Rollins Pass was first traversed by the U.S. Army in 1860 and later became a wagon trail to the town of Rollinsville. And the railroad would come in the 20th century due to the activity of David Moffett, who was a prominent businessman in the Denver area who wanted to build his own transcontinental railroad. The railroad would take so long to complete, 1904 to 1928, due to not only the geography and terrain of the Rocky Mountains, but the activities of V.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad. He did what he could to hinder the construction of the railroad, mostly by doing his behind-the-scenes shenanigans to make sure there is less, if any, funding going to this construction project, because he didn't want any competition between his railroad and anyone else, frankly. And on the map, between Cheyenne and Ogden, that's the Union Pacific, which in the Rio Grande map is getting blanked out, which makes sense due to their long-standing rivalry. The railroad eventually made it to Craig, Colorado, which is just below the Moffett Tunnel route logo here, in 1920, and was built over the Rockies at the same mountain that Moffett Tunnel goes through in 1922, or in 1920, and in 1922 is when the Moffett Tunnel was chartered by the Colorado legislature. At this point, David Moffett had passed, and the railroad had been reorganized into the Denver and Rio Grande Western that we know to this day, or at least historically, because it's now a part of Union Pacific. Moffett Tunnel was opened 6 years later in 1928, and this cut the 23-mile route over the mountains with a few 4% grades that took hours to complete to a 6.2-mile tunnel that took 12 minutes to travel through. This made the route far more valuable and reliable, which is the most important thing in logistics, and the old railroad route is now an off-road trail for, dirt bikes and whatnot. The Western Pacific has a related history to that of the Rio Grande Western. But before we get into that, the surveyor Arthur Ketty was the first person who wanted to build a railroad between Salt Lake City and San Francisco through Beckworth Pass. This plan would have the railroad crossing the Sierras 2,000 feet lower than the competing Southern Pacific Overland route, and would have a maximum grade of 1%. For comparison, the main selling point of the Overland route over this route through Beckworth Pass was that the Southern Pacific route was 150 miles shorter than the Feather River route, which in the terms of transcontinental logistics doesn't really mean that much if you're a railroad, or ship for that matter. That's a future video topic. But anyways, construction of the Western Pacific started in 1903 after George Goode, who owned the Missouri Pacific and Rio Grande at this time, got involved. He wanted an empire of railroads that truly crossed the country, and eventually I'll make a video on that in the future, but today is not that day. Long story short is that he put the Rio Grande up as collateral to secure funding for the Western Pacific, which was a humongous gamble. The Western Pacific was completed, but they both went into receivership in 1916, about 7 or so years after the Western Pacific was completed. Construction began in Salt Lake City, and one of the main designs was that it would have no curve exceeding 10 degrees, which forced the construction of William Loop seen in the picture near Spring Garden, California. This loop is similar to Tehachapi Loop over Tehachapi Pass, where the trains pass over itself to change elevation to keep the grade from exceeding 1%, or the length of the route. As time would go on, construction did start from Oakland and run eastward. The route from Oakland went south to what is now Fremont, crossing Sentinel Grade to the Livermore Valley, going through the valley to over another set of passes, which is Altamont Pass, to Stockton, and then north through Stockton, Sacramento, and up to Oroville, where it would start the climb along the Feather River. The route was completed on November 1st, 1909 at Keddie, California, where a foreman named Leonard D. Tomaso drove the last spike and the railroad was open. According to some sources, there was a quote-unquote gold spike ceremony, and according to at least another source, it was just a standard, we're driving the last spike and we're getting going. I can't really confirm either way. I know pretty sure there was no gold spike. Probably was some sort of ceremony, but it was definitely not to the same level as the first transcontinental railroad, or frankly most railroads that were completed in this era, considering by 1909 this was very much the last transcontinental railroad ever to be built. And, well, wait, come to think of it now, I actually think I can't remember if the Milwaukee Road was completed around the same time or not. But it was the last one that it still exists to this day, unlike the Milwaukee Road Pacific Extension. Again, totally different video topic. I'll try to keep to the point. Anyways, when the railroad was completed, Arthur Keddie was still alive, and he rode the first passenger train and did some speaking engagements in the years after, telling about how the railroad was built and just the journey of the Western Pacific up until its completion. The other point of interest for the Western Pacific was that it ran directionally between Winnemucca and Wells, Nevada, where it paralleled the Southern Pacific's overland route. Little quibble I have to have with pedantic people. Technically, it did not go from Winnemucca to Wells because it went to like a few miles outside of town because whatever. No one knows. I honestly don't even think there's a town there now and never was, but we don't know. Most people don't know where these points are, and neither do I, frankly, and I lived in Nevada. So we're going with Winnemucca and Wells, and so those are the named towns that still exist. So again, quibble with it in the comments, but I don't really care if you're going to quibble about it. And as for running directionally, I also note that I have read for the overland route video that this practice didn't start until World War I, when the railroads were put under federal control for the war effort. And granted, this was only like 7 years into its existence, so it's not like it didn't go very long as a single track railroad, even in areas where it effectively was double tracked. And prior to World War II, this was the only part of the Western Pacific that had automatic block signaling. And this was extended from Oakland to Portola during World War II due to the increase in traffic for that war. Which also I will mention that even though the Southern Pacific was the main contributor to the war effort, logistically speaking, in California, the Western Pacific did still pick up a lot of traffic as well, as did most railroads in the country at this time. Now this is where we're going to start talking about the trains that ran the route before the California Zephyr. The two at least that I can find the sparsest and the least amount of information possible are the Scenic Limited and the Pacific Express. The Scenic Limited was a train that ran between St. Louis and Oakland in conjunction with the Missouri Pacific. At this point was still partially owners of the Western Pacific through the Good Empire. Also, I don't know if it's Good or Gould. Just saying that now, not sure. Again, it's one of those things. It's like if you see things read and you don't always know how they're pronounced officially. But again, English, we don't have standard pronunciations for a lot of things, so just gonna roll with it. This train, the Scenic Limited that is, started running in 1915, and according to the Western Pacific schedule, the train had sections to Chicago over the CB&Q. The part that I'm unclear about is when exactly the Scenic Limited stopped running. What I can say for certain is that it ran over the Royal Gorge route, which means it ran to Pueblo and started running west there through the Royal Gorge route through Tennessee Pass. And service along the Royal Gorge route, as far as I know, ran until 1967 as a daytime service between Pueblo and Glenwood Springs, where it met with the post-war Prospector, which hopefully will be shown on the picture now. The Prospector post-war was a overnight companion train to the California Zephyr, and for, I believe, a brief time, the Exposition Flyer as well, that ran between Denver, Salt Lake, and Ogden. Also, before the California Zephyr and the Exposition Flyer, there was also the Pacific Express, which had connecting services between Butte, Fort Worth, Colorado Springs, and Chicago over various railroads. And just like the Scenic Limited, I'm not entirely sure when exactly this train stopped running on the Western Pacific and Rio Grande. All I can tell is that these trains ran on separate schedules and crossed the Sierra Nevadas at different times of the day, one crossing in the evening and one crossing in like mid-morning, well, afternoon into evening. And also, because of the time, I'm not entirely sure what the service levels on these trains were, and we'll get into that in a minute, but I do know at one point the trains had parlor and sleeping cars, and this was before the Streamline era and into World War II. But we'll get into when we start talking about the Exposition Flyer, we'll get into a little bit of my issue, I guess, in a minute. And although I don't have a picture of it here, the pre-war Prospector was a motor coach similar to the Pioneer Zephyr that ran the same route between Denver and Ogden. And if there's enough information, I will eventually talk about its and other Rio Grande passenger trains in a future video. But as of right now, it's not getting talked about. The Exposition Flyer is the train that most directly predates the California Zephyr. It started running to transport passengers to the Golden Gate International Exposition, which was celebrating the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge. The train started running in 1939 and would continue to run even after the exposition was over. This train remained on the schedule until the launch of the California Zephyr in 1949. During most of its existence, the train ran with older heavyweight equipment, and towards the end started getting hand-me-down streamline equipment, and I believe that was almost entirely from the CB&Q. Which gets us into the thing of as to why I don't really know what the level of service was on these trains, because from what it seems like is the Rio Grande and Western Pacific prior to the California Zephyr pretty much ran secondary services exclusively, at least compared to the first class trains that would have been running at the time, even in the earlier part of the Streamline era and after and before. So again, I'm not really sure to what extent the service levels were on these trains, because again, they're running with like older equipment, and these were smaller railroads, so they didn't really have the resources of like the CB&Q to like always have new and modern equipment. Anyways, the most notable or infamous thing of the Exposition Flyer was its involvement in the Naperville train crash in 1946. This is when the regular section of the Flyer slanted to the advanced section of the Flyer when it stopped at the Naperville train station. And I believe the story was it wasn't supposed to be stopped. Anyways, the trains crashed into each other. Well, the moving train crashed into the stop train at 85 miles an hour and killed 47 people. And on that note, we're going to just transition briefly and quickly to the California Zephyr. The Zephyr was one of the post-war streamliners that started running to cash in on the post-war travel boom. And this was based on the success of the Zephyrs that the CB&Q was running in the east, the post-war Vista Domes, which are the dome cars on the train that were developed after the war, and the CB&Q wanting a first-rate streamliner over its transcontinental route to Northern California. I know it's not technically its route, but it was like the route that it ran in conjunction with a bunch of other railroads. Anyways, it was common for like the bigger railroad or the more prominent railroad to think of the trains that ran on partner railroads as it, regardless of whether or not it ran them the entire way. The Union Pacific also did the same thing with the city fleet, just as for instance. According to sources online, the CB&Q sent Bud's designer John Haberson out along the route, and according to his plans, each consist should have at least 5 dome cars. This would maximize the viewing ability of the passenger, since the main selling point of taking this route would be the scenery. This train was also planned entirely around the scenery instead of just being a business train, and this bet really did pay off because the train still maintained relatively high ridership even after ridership started tanking on railroads due to airlines and the highways. The railway placed an order for 6 train sets from Bud, each one having its own. Each railroad had 2 train sets between them, and the first normal train set consisted of a baggage car, 3 Vista Dome coaches, a dining car, a coach dorm buffet car, a tourist sleeper, 3 regular sleepers, and a dome sleeper observation car on the end, which also had, the dome. Um, and on the slide, we'll be showing a promotional shot from the Western Pacific of the California Zephyr running somewhere in the mountains. I'm not entirely sure where this was because this picture was either pulled from Wikipedia or Pinterest, and I don't always get a description of them when when you pull them off of certain websites. The California Zephyr was a big improvement over the old Exposition Flyer when it launched on March 20th, 1949. The main one being the upgrade from being essentially, as I said, a secondary train with a mix of heavyweight and surplus lightweight equipment. Not only this, but the train was sped up by having an all lightweight consist and new E and F units pulling them. The old Flyer would take 60 hours to make its trip from Chicago to Oakland, which was, for a transcontinental train, actually pretty standard Chicago to Pacific Coast travel times. But the new Zephyr took 51 hours, which is 11 hours slower than the competing city of San Francisco, and I believe about 4 hours longer than the San Francisco Chief would eventually run. But the Zephyr had much better scenery than either of these trains, and was time to show it off, and this is part of the reason why it remains so popular and is still one of Amtrak's more popular routes. Another major aspect of the route was the service provided by the staff, particularly the Zephyrettes. As mentioned in the video on the CB&Q Zephyrs, they were nurse stewardesses on the pre-war Zephyrs, and they were generally young women who were social directors, tour guides, and stewardesses who did anything the crew and passengers asked of them. The position was created by Velma McPeak, who ran the passenger division of the CB&Q in the 1930s, and they would remain on the train until March 1970 when the Western Pacific was cleared to drop their segment of the train by the ICC, bringing an end to the first incarnation of the Zephyr. I'll also note that the Zephyrettes, for whatever tax reasons, were technically employees of the Western Pacific, which is why when their section was dropped, the Zephyrettes were no longer working for the railroad or on the successor trains because the other railways didn't want to pay for them. And also, I believe at this point, when the Zephyr launched, at least the California Zephyr, the Zephyrettes were, I believe, not on the CB&Q at that point. It was a wartime austerity thing. They got rid of them because of the war, and then they just never brought it back except for on the California Zephyr. But before it ended, it tried to bring a sense of luxury and prestige to the train, even though most people of note would take trains such as the Chiefs or the City Fleet. The staff still treated everyone as though they were famous. The one thing they did on board to try to be first class was to emulate the turquoise room on the Super Chief in the buffet lounge, and they had their own little area called the cable car room, which had murals of locations around the Bay Area. California Zephyr was a major success, as it averaged an 80% load factor, and sold-out runs persisted well into the 60s. This pushed the railroad to buy more equipment in 1952, about 3 years after launch, but high ridership also couldn't counteract the costs and the slow rise in regulated rates. This mostly hurt the smaller Western Pacific, who was already pushing to discontinue its remaining passenger trains at this point. By this point, its train to Portola had been canceled, as well as its segment of the Royal Gorge, which ran to Pueblo, Colorado through the Tennessee Pass and Royal Gorge line. By this point, their segment of the Royal Gorge was replaced by the tri-weekly RDC service between Oakland and Salt Lake City, and this too would come to an end in 1960, about 10 years after it started. And on the picture, or on the slide, is a picture of one of the RDCs. I believe they only had 2 that ran in the entire fleet, and this is one of them, as it would have been, I think, going somewhere along the Sacramento Northern. I'm not entirely sure where, though. The end of the first California Zephyr came in 1970, after the Western Pacific was allowed to drop its last passenger train. Part of the stipulation was that the CB&Q and the Rio Grande would continue running a tri-weekly service between Chicago and Ogden to connect with the Southern Pacific. The Rio Grande, on the other hand, would keep their train running until the 1980s, since they considered it more economical to maintain their last passenger train instead of joining Amtrak. And this train would continue to run on a tri-weekly schedule as an all-coach train between Denver and Ogden. But before we jump entirely into Amtrak land, we need to talk a little bit about the food service on the California Zephyr in its heyday. So I have taken a screenshot of a lunch menu and have thrown it into the slide. Thank you, Streamline Memories, I believe is where I pulled the PDF from. So the lunch menu has your four, meal options, a bunch of entree a la carte options, and just is a very thick menu. The meals including veal, ox joints, ham and egg, bacon and eggs, something called a Spanish omelet, and a steamed hattie, which I believe is a fish. Normally a menu this dense, at least based on the research I've done for the other trains videos that I've done on this channel, would mostly be reserved for a dinner menu. And the only menu from this time period that I can find that was as dense as this one would have been a Super Chief menu from also the early to mid 1950s. So compared to a lot of other railways, they did do a lot to increase the experience level of this train over, honestly, even to some extent, the city fleet. I know the Union Pacific was also very, very big on having the best passenger service it possibly could. But for whatever reason, the California Zephyr still tried to be better than them in some ways because they were, frankly, advertising more to tourists and people who would be on vacation rather than people who are traveling on business. Anyways, we're going to be jumping into the Amtrak era. And in 1970, when Amtrak was created, the Rio Grande did not join Amtrak. It wouldn't do so until 1983. So Amtrak couldn't use the Moffat Tunnel route to get its trains to Salt Lake City, which led to Amtrak combining its trains into, the Denver Zephyr and the city of San Francisco into one train known as the San Francisco Zephyr, and ran, I believe, on the Burlington between Denver and Cheyenne. This route ran through Ogden, whereas the current California Zephyr runs through Salt Lake City. The San Francisco Zephyr ran on a tri-weekly schedule to start and then quickly turned into a daily train. This train linked up with the Denver Zephyr in Denver, but not Ogden, for whatever reason. And after the Rio Grande joined Amtrak in 1983, the California Zephyr was shifted onto its current route with the current name, which follows the old route at the very least between Galesburg, Illinois, and Winnemucca, Nevada. And for the sake of clarification, I'm not entirely sure if the route between Union Station and Galesburg is either the old CB&Q route or the old Santa Fe route, because I also know the Southwest Chief uses the same route for that stretch as well. So again, I'm not really sure. And sometimes digging for little tiny details is very difficult. And from Winnemucca westward, the train runs on the Southern Pacific's overland route into Oakland, which is a more direct route, sort of, as we mentioned, and runs through Reno, which adds at least a lot of value to the route as far as travel goes out in Northern California. And as far as I know, presently there are no plans on expanding anything to do with the Zephyr, except for maybe the state of Nevada calling for the train to run twice daily like most trains did before Amtrak, and them actually calling for there being additional service between Oakland and Reno. And I'm not entirely sure if there's any calls for additional service to anywhere else along the route, except for maybe the old Rock Island route, but again, that's kind of getting into the quibble that I don't want to have right now. I also know that at least before the pandemic, there was the ski train out of Denver to Glenwood Springs and Winter Park that I hopefully will start running again after the pandemic is over, but again, I'm not entirely sure, so we're just going to leave it there. And I hope you do enjoy, and hope you enjoyed the newer format and that you like it, and hopefully that this works better in the long run and just makes life easier. Anyways, I hope you did enjoy, and come back for the next one, and I will see you then.